welcome, Cass. It is absolutely my pleasure to host this conversation with you today. Um, yeah, I'm just very excited that you're here with us to talk about the topic of the day on deliberate ignorance. And just to give a little bit of background, first of all, we in IAAP, the International Association of Applied Psychology, are always looking for people who are going to push the boundaries and help us to think of things in new ways. And you always have a way of doing that in my own life personally and for the profession more broadly. So we were just delighted when you agreed to write for Applied Psychology Around the World, our publication, which is available to anybody in the world who wants to read about it. And I know that you and I talked about this, gosh, quite some time ago. The idea that you might write a focal article, we could invite some commentaries. And it percolated for a while. And then I received an email one day and you said, "This is what I want to write about." So I want to jump off from that point and ask you what brought this topic to your mind? Why deliberate ignorance? And what does that mean to you?
It's pretty fundamental. So both for individual life and for business and for governments. So we are constantly thinking consciously or maybe processing very rapidly what we want to know or what we want not to know or what we don't want to know. So if the question involves something involving our health or our safety or our well-being, there are plenty of things that we really want to know. And there are lots of things that we don't want to know because they might make us sad or they might clutter our mind or they might make us scared. Sometimes we make very sensible choices about what to know and what not to know. So
Mhm.
not to know the number of hairs on the head of everyone in Paris. I'm not particularly interested in that. And that's probably rational. There's nothing I could do with that. And many people are keenly interested in things that will make their health improve. And many people are interested in things that will increase their economic opportunities and so forth.
Mhm.
But many people sometimes are averse to knowing things, even if they'd be useful, because they would be distressing. And because this is at the center of both individual life and public policy, it
Uh-huh.
seems to me kind of bedrock.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I don't know that I'd really thought about it in those terms until I read your article, which will be released quite soon. Um, and you make the distinction in the article, and I think you touched on it very lightly just now, between not wanting to know and wanting not to know. And I really had to think about that for a while as I was reading, and I'm wondering if you could break that down for us, the difference between the two.
Okay, let me tell you a story. So, when I worked in the White House, we explored a rule that would require calorie labels on at restaurants like McDonald's or Burger King. And there was a question whether to apply this to movie theaters. And I was keen on that. I thought that was in the public interest, but many people in the White House thought it wasn't a good idea. We didn't have enough data
Mm.
suggesting that inclusion of movie theaters in the requirement would promote public health. So I suggested, well, we don't have data. Why don't we leave the option open and ask the
Mhm.
public, including experts on obesity and psychology, to help us provide the information? And so
Mhm.
we said we weren't going to do that, but we asked for public comments. And when public comments came in,
Mhm.
people switched and thought, okay, now we have the evidence, we're going to apply it to movie theaters. I sent a celebratory note to a friend who responded with three words: Cass ruined popcorn. And I thought that was a brilliant, though somewhat deflating response. The idea was that many people, it's not that they don't want to know about the
Mhm.
calories in their popcorn. It's that they want not to know. So sometimes there are things that you don't want to know. Please don't tell me. Down the corridor from where I'm uh, privileged to speak to you is a colleague of mine who one day I engaged on the fact that our course evaluations had come in, and he said, "That's terrible. I don't want to read them." And it's not that he thought that knowing was a matter of indifference. It's he really didn't want to know because if the course evaluations weren't so good by his own account, he'd be mad at his students and sad and teach less well because sadness and madness do not uh, lead to good teaching. So he didn't want to know. There's a lot of things we affirmatively want not to know and we pay not to receive. And I'm
Mhm.
data on this, including some recent data I can tell you about if you like. And there's also a lot of things that we have no particular interest in. So I'm not really interested in calculus. This is a
Mhm.
character failure. But if someone found an easy way to teach me calculus, I wouldn't say, no, please don't tell me. I'd say, okay, it's easy. I guess that's fine to know some calculus. So take this point as there are many things that we affirmatively avoid. Our
Mhm.
day would be better, we think, if we didn't get the information. And there are other things that we just don't care to know. We don't have any particular interest.
Interesting. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that prompted about 10 different thoughts on my end, but two of them in particular. So tell me about the research. So this is, yeah, something, the article that you wrote for APAW is a thought piece. And I'd love to hear what you're thinking about from an empirical standpoint, how you're testing this, what you're looking into.
Okay, so I've worked for many years on data collection on what people want to know and what they don't want to know. And I
Mm,
can tell you some vivid things from the recent past, and then I'll tell you about some unpublished work. So people don't want to know when they're going to die. So we have
mm,
data on this that the vast majority of people, they just don't want to know when they're going to die. People
mm,
don't want to know, some around half, sometimes a little more than half, depending on exactly how the question is phrased and the exact population. They don't want to know what other people actually think about them. A lot of people think I don't want visibility into that. It might disappoint me a bit. People don't want to know, about half, a little less than half in some of our work, a little more in some of our work. They don't want to know if they're going to get Alzheimer's or if they're going to get cancer. That people
mm,
are reluctant to get that information.
mhm,
Recent data I've been collecting, the unpublished data with a research team, is in about half a dozen nations on whether people want to know about how animals are treated in agriculture, in clothing, in other domains. That
mhm,
on labels. And while we find in the countries we tested, a majority tends to want to know, a strong
mhm,
minority, they just don't want to know. And there's a division between people who think, I don't want to know that. That's boring. It's a little annoying. My head's already got a lot of stuff in it. And
mhm,
people who think I affirmatively want not to know. Please don't ruin my popcorn. Please don't tell me about how animals were treated in the
mhm,
clothing because it's just going to make me upset and guilty. And I'd
mhm.
prefer you not tell me, and I'm willing to pay you some money not to tell me.
Wow. So what would be, okay, two questions. One is there a typical experimental protocol that you use to collect these kinds of data? That's one question. And then another one is to what degree is this conscious versus subconscious? And I guess in my mind, that's kind of related to the protocol, is how can we suss this out when we're trying to evaluate this in populations?
The ongoing work where we really have a massive data collection that's just been completed, we're in the midst of analyzing it. The survey instrument's pretty simple. We ask
Mhm,
people, do you want to know? Do you want not to know? Do you want, do you already have the information? So three categories, I already have it. I want to know it. I want not to know it. And then we ask them contingent on wanting to know, how much would you pay for it? And on contingent on wanting not to know, how much would you pay not to get it? And typically the amount that people are willing to pay to receive it is a bit higher than the amount they're willing to pay not to get it, contingent on not wanting it. So a very simple instrument. Then we have a bunch of variables like, do you have a domestic animal? Do you have a pet? Do you care about the environment? How old are you? What are your politics? And So we have an assortment of questions like that, and we test for the relationship between such variables as I would an affirmative answer to the question, I would be upset if I received information of this kind, or I would be helpfully informed by
Mm,
information of this kind because it would be relevant to my purchasing behavior. So
mm,
correlate people's emotional reaction to the information, their uh, value of the information for their actual behavior, the instrumental value, and also their curiosity, pure curiosity. And we can map all of those onto whether they want the information or they don't want it. And our hypotheses were, as you'd expect, if people think it's useful, they're going to want it. If
mhm,
they're going to be upset by it, they're not going to want it. And if they're curious, they're going to want it. And that's basically the story we find, though we're still digging into exactly which variables are strongest. One big lesson is that ruining popcorn is a real thing for information involving animal welfare, and this is relevant to a zillion things, including personal information involving health, like, are you susceptible to X or Y or Z? Doctors often struggle with this, and that can have a negative effect on their success. That is, their doctor's success with their patients. If patients don't want to know anything about cardiac risks, then the doctor has a challenge. In addition to helping the patient medically, the doctor
mhm.
has a psychological challenge, which is overcoming information avoidance, which can result in patients saying, please, please don't tell me, or I'm not going to go on this medicine for a while because I don't want to think about it. And we're finding in the animal welfare domain that's pretty acute with respect to a minority. They don't
Mhm,
want the information. And that suggests that labeling efforts and information campaigns might not work because
mhm.
people might bracket the information or show reactance by saying, government, you're trying to get me focused on animal welfare. I'm going to have a lot of chicken and steak tonight.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. That's very interesting. Do you think that it invokes sort of cognitive dissonance in people when they're asked to reflect on these questions?
A little bit. Cognitive dissonance kicks in when people don't want to explore the conflict between their actual behavior and
Hmm.
their moral values.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
they may do that by thinking, there's nothing I can do to help animals,
Yeah.
or animals aren't treated so badly.
Yeah.
You're not going to live forever anyhow. And so in dismissing the information, there is an effort to avoid thinking I'm contributing to something not very good.
Yep.
And there's a parallel between self-interested behavior, which involves, there's an article by George Akerlof, a psychologically attuned economist who won the Nobel Prize, and it's a paper on cognitive dissonance, exactly. And
Mm.
it's closely related to this. He says that workers don't want to know information involving the safety risks that they're facing. And that confounds standard economic thinking about safety, because if workers are balancing, let's say, money and leisure time and safety,
Hmm.
then
Yeah.
everything's going to be great. Neoclassical economics goes in that direction. But if workers are unwilling to believe that they face serious risk or optimistically bias, as Shelley Taylor did foundational work on optimistic bias, then
Hmm.
Akerlof says there's something that's going to get screwed up in the
Mm.
worker safety domain. And that is a dissonant story about self. There are dissonant stories about moral behavior where our own moral convictions may not align with our choices, and then we might not want information that points out the disparity.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, I can understand exactly what you're saying, and I can also relate to it on a personal level because as I read your article about deliberate ignorance, I found myself thinking quite a lot about it, both at an academic level, but even in my own personal life. And I think that it triggered some cognitive dissonance in me. On the one hand, we like to think of ourselves as wanting to know, and not being terribly self-interested. And yet, as I started to think about this concept, I started to think about examples where I was avoiding when I had to really sit down and think about it, avoiding information that would serve others better. So it's just a fascinating concept. And as you've already illustrated through this conversation, it can be applied across a wide, wide variety of domains. I mean, you've given examples, from food to student evaluations, et cetera, et cetera. The example that you chose to really highlight in this article was around animal welfare. So I wanted to ask about that. Why animal welfare? Why did you choose that as your illustrative concept for deliberate ignorance?
Thank you for that. It's an area that I personally care about. So the question of whether animals are suffering or not matters to me. It's an area where the disjunction between a widespread moral conviction, which is basically in the domain of what I just described. People love their dogs and cats. They love horses. The idea that a living creature is living a life of suffering and distress, that people don't like that at all. And yet our own behavior contributes to that. This is very regrettable. That word is probably too weak. So why is it that we contribute to practices that are uh, producing outcomes that are inconsistent with our moral convictions? A big reason is we don't want to know. And there's a lot of data that's not engaging the psychological literature directly also, always,
Mm-hmm.
but which does find that people don't want to know about how pigs and chicken are treated. They say they don't want to know. And
Yeah.
when they're asked why they don't want to know, they say, I feel guilty. And many of the people who say they feel guilty indicate they change their behavior, but they don't welcome that. And
Mm-hmm.
they don't look forward to that. And I'm a recent convert to vegetarian, I should say. And I didn't do it with, unambivalent enthusiasm. I like the taste of chicken and beef. So this was a mixed thing. But working on this topic kind of led me there.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. So, with all of that, is there any bright side to deliberate ignorance? Is it always a bad thing? Um, why does it exist? And are there any advantages?
Sure. So if people want to know everything,
Mm-hmm.
then their time would be eaten up by information acquisition. So not wanting to know is extremely good. It's
Mm-hmm.
essential.
Okay.
So the idea that, many people don't want to know a zillion bits of information keeps their day at least less distracted than it would otherwise be, and maybe kind of orderly and pleasant. So that's about not wanting to know. Now, wanting not to know, like affirmatively not wanting to know things,
Mm-hmm.
can be also excellent because there are a lot of things you could know that would make you sad. And it's not great to be sad all the time. In fact, it's good to be sad uh, not a lot of the time. There's a place for sadness, of course, but to have either a conscious or, as you say, unconscious, but very rapid uh,
Mm-hmm.
practice of learning things that will make you upbeat and not learning things that will make you sad, that's adaptive. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
If people learned all sorts of things about their own vulnerabilities, they might be able to reduce the vulnerabilities. That's positive, but maybe not. And maybe the things they learn would just make their days worse. So people's widespread and many nations desire not to know when they're going to die, that
Hmm.
probably makes a lot of sense because people don't think, uh-oh, 2047, it's all over. So
Hmm.
that's great. And not wanting to know the calories in your popcorn.
Yeah.
That isn't irrational. When people are eating popcorn, they might want to think this is great, not I'm gaining some weight right now.
Right. Right. Okay. So it's adaptive to an extent. There are upsides. How would you summarize the downsides then to this tendency?
Well, there's self and there's others.
Okay.
So if you think I'm just not going to go to the doctor for the next 5 years
Hmm.
because something negative is probably going to emerge
Hmm.
and that's going to make me a little sad, that would not be excellent for at least many people because you might have a little bit of anxiety or a little bit of disappointment, but you might have a lot of better health.
Hmm.
So this is a first order public policy question where it's just a fact that many people don't attend to their health because they think that thinking about health risks is, uh, scary. But
Yeah.
if they did attend to their health, then they'd be healthier and live longer.
Yeah.
Or if people are smokers, for example, to learn about the risks associated with smoking might be distressing, but it might be an impetus for ceasing. So the downside is that the negative emotional impact might be way outweighed by the positive health impact. And we have
Hmm.
suggesting that when people learn kind of tough things about themselves and maybe there's a risk they're facing in their life, the day is worse, but the
Hmm.
month isn't worse. People habituate very quickly and they don't anticipate their own capacity to habituate. We've all observed this with some people who have a setback and they think it's going to be terrible, but then they deal quite well with it, or at least better than would be expected. And that's part of our, amazing resilience. So that's about self. With respect to
Hmm.
others, there's an amazing book about the Holocaust, which is the only book I know that is kind of very pleasant reading about the Holocaust because it's improbably um, funny. It's about a guy who went back to Germany in the 1950s, an American of German heritage, who went back and made friends with former Nazis. And he didn't expect them to be friends. And they weren't high up in the party or anything. They weren't, full of hate. They were regular people who got swept up and, did what people did under conditions of horribleness. Now, they didn't kill people particularly. They were just part of the system. And what makes it comical is the people are charming. They're all charming, and they're not evil charming. They're just humanly charming. They're like people. And he said, I liked them. They were my friends, and he didn't expect that. One of them, he said he wanted to learn German, so let's read the Bible together. And he read the Bible with his friend, who was very exuberant and funny and full of spirit. And they read a part of the Bible that is about evil and the triumph of evil. And the reason the author of the book did it was he wasn't at this moment trying to learn German. He was
Hmm.
trying to see how his friend would deal with a biblical passage that clearly would recall Hitler and the slaughter of Jews. And his friend started to get very quiet, which was the German friend, which was very uncharacteristic and very subdued and looked down. And he never did that. And the American of German heritage asked his German friend, what's going on with you? And he said, very darkly, he said, this is hard. This is very hard. And that was an encounter by exuberant former Nazi, not a leader, not anyone who killed anyone particularly, but he wasn't a murderer. He was just part of a system. But he read the passage of the Bible, which reminded him what had happened in his country, which he kind of knew about, but wasn't thinking about and tried not to know. So with
Hmm.
respect to moral, not good things,
Yeah.
um, the bracketing of things that we maybe are bystanders to, or
Mhm.
in some loose sense participate in. It can make our days better, but it can also help those things to continue. I was talking to a historian as part of this process of working on this paper, so thank
Mm.
you. A historian who read the paper and said, with slavery, it was about deliberate ignorance, that a lot of white people who weren't slave owners, and some who were, weren't as alert as they might have been to the
Mhm.
horrors that slavery was. And that one of the things that got abolition going, that fueled it, was visible accounts, sometimes in paintings or photographs, of what slavery actually entailed. And then slavery was, in at least worse trouble as a perpetuated practice than it would otherwise have been. So a downside to deliberate ignorance is that things that aren't so great can continue. I might say that when I was a young law professor, I started to get interested in feminism and the law of sexual harassment. And I read some amazing work by Catherine McKinnon on sexual harassment and how it's a form of discrimination. And my mother asked me on Sunday, as she did when we would always talk on Sunday, what I was working on. And I said this, and she was very upset. She said, "That's terrible. Don't think about that." And I said, "It's important." And she said, "No, you work on constitutional law. You don't do this feminism stuff." I think she thought it was bad for my career. And she was very upset, and she could be a tiger, my mother, and it was a very unpleasant talking to she gave me. Now I'm my mother's son, so when she fiercely told me to stay away from this area, I kind of got upset with her. And I said to her, here's what Professor McKinnon's saying. Here are things that happen in American workplaces. This is a form of discrimination. It's important. This is what it's actually happening in our country. And there's an effort to say that it's a civil rights violation. And my mother went quiet for the only
Mm.
time I recall. And then she said three words to me that she never said to me before and she never said after. It's the only time in her life she said these three words to me. She said, "God bless you." And,
Oh.
and I think when she said that, she was a woman in a generation where, and I don't need to finish the sentence, but she knew everything about the topic. She knew much more about the topic than I did. And when she said, "God bless you," she was saying, "I can tell you some stories. And on reflection, forgive me for getting emotional, on reflection, I don't regret you're working on this."
Wow.
That was about, deliberate ignorance on the part of some, or at least bracketing. And then, in sexual harassment, it continues, but it's against the law. There's a lot less of it than there would otherwise be
Yeah.
because of overcoming deliberate ignorance. At least
Yeah.
that's part of it.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Thank you for sharing that story. And if there's one thing I know about you, it's that you haven't shied away from topics that could be bad for your career in the course of your career. And we're all the beneficiaries of that. So thank you.
Okay.
What a story. So I think a couple of final questions. One is, this article that you've written around deliberate ignorance will be released soon. Anyone in the world can pick it up, can read it. I hope that it will open some eyes and provoke some thoughts. What do you hope people will walk away with? And what, if anything, do you hope they might do differently after reading this article?
Thank you for that. There are a couple things. One is the topic of deliberate ignorance is just unendingly interesting. Of everything I've worked on, I've never found anything as interesting as this, quite. Maybe because it's so fundamental, maybe because we can all recognize it, and it does have a humorous aspect with people thinking, "Please, please don't tell me about 1,001 things." So the first thing is to put a spotlight on deliberate ignorance as a phenomenon that we can see in multiple places and sometimes celebrate and sometimes mourn. The second is if one has research in view or a capacity to practice in these areas. There's so much we don't know about deliberate ignorance. We know much more about it now than we did 10 years ago,
Mm.
but people really want to know, an irony here, about deliberate ignorance. And with the desire to know comes more knowledge. And my hope is in the next 5 years, we're going to have uh, a world of new information about this, including an understanding of how to overcome deliberate ignorance.
Mm.
So there's Linda Thunstrom, an economist at the University of Wisconsin, one of my heroes, has done one of the first papers on overcoming deliberate ignorance. And she has a set of ideas, all of which are empirically grounded. We can think of, if people think information is going to make them sad, so they don't want to know, if they learn it's not going to make them very sad and they're going to be able to use it and their lives will be better, then that's helpful. And that's one of Thunstrom's ideas, but she has others. Still hers, she would, I'm sure, would say, is just an initial stab at this. So to do better research in psychology and other areas, even, a short investigation of one phenomenon can be
Mhm.
a universe in a grain of sand. And I'm hopeful that with respect to animal welfare,
Yeah.
this is an area where small steps can help real living creatures, and to put a spotlight on practices, you take your pick, that are things we probably would wish were otherwise, and understand them and maybe contribute to their reform. That would be a step forward.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I must say that I have really enjoyed thinking about this topic since I read your piece and talking about it. And whether it's talking to colleagues or whether it's talking to family members or anyone in between, it is something that people, I think, are fascinated by. They enjoy grappling with or arguing about it or whatever the case may be. So opening up the eyes and the minds of our readers and others to this topic, I think, is going to lead to, like you say, a whole world of information. I would love to see research on this continue, including, as you mentioned, research around how to combat the dark side of deliberate ignorance. I'm curious what's next for you in this area.
I'm in the midst, really, your
Yeah.
time is phenomenal, of a large empirical study of deliberate ignorance. And it happens to focus on animal welfare, but it could focus on anything. And we have so much data, we're trying to assemble a coherent tale. This is, of course, not the first time any of us have had this uh, lucky challenge. So that's a project I'm heavily engaged in right now. In the closing stages of a book called Animals Matter, which is a book about animal welfare and what to do about it. And there's discussion of deliberate ignorance there. Also, cascade effects when people learn from each other, and
Mhm.
eventually you have, the United States becomes an independent nation, or the United Kingdom exits from the European Union, and the large-scale changes often come from cascade effects in which people follow each other. And there's an exploration of that phenomenon in the book.
Oh, we'll be on the lookout for it. That's great. Well, before we wrap up, if I can even just broaden this out for a last question, really means a lot to me that you're willing to have this conversation and write this article for us. We have overlapped throughout the course of my career in different places in different ways at the White House, at the UN, and now here within the International Association of Applied Psychology. And within IAAP, we have our big three strategic goals. So the first one is global influence, the second one is global growth, and the third one is operational excellence. And I want to talk about that first one around global influence because one of the things in the field of psychology that I would like to see is a greater capacity to influence public policy. You mentioned public policy a little bit earlier. And I think one of the barriers is figuring out how to best communicate our insights in a way that the public at large, policymakers, others can understand and make use of those insights. And you have been better than anyone that I know at being able to make that translation. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts around that, any advice, so that all of this wealth of information from the field of psychology in particular and behavioral sciences more broadly can be best utilized.
Well, I've been lucky to learn from you and, hundreds of psychologists information that's central to solving public policy challenges. There's at Penn a medical team that works on behavioral uh, initiatives where psychology is front and center. And it's not a government, but it's doing really fundamental work.
Mm,
I worked at the World Health Organization for a time, and the director was very focused on psychology. And the reason he was so focused on psychology is he knew that knew and knows that health challenges can't be solved without an understanding of how the human mind works. So you may know a ton about what to do to deal with, some illness, but if you don't know how people respond to that, you won't be able to make nearly as much progress as you need to. So to have, maybe this is another way to put it. When I worked in my first job in the White House under Obama, I learned quickly that if I talked about psychology in the abstract,
mhm.
people think this is academic stuff, and maybe I
Okay.
should go back to academic life. But if I talked about air pollution or uh, pandemics, which we
Hmm.
talk about, or about occupational safety,
Hmm.
then people's eyes lit up. So if the psychology is clearly relevant, or smoking cessation, so
Hmm.
there's a lot of attention under the Obama administration, smoking cessation. You can't think about that without thinking about psychology.
Hmm.
So if there's a label for, encouraging people to purchase fuel efficient cars, how's that label going to work with the human mind? We redesigned a label. It's still the label that's on all cars. I'd be shocking if it's the best label. It was done, over 10 years ago, and we did our best, but there could be a better label.
Yeah.
And depending on what the goal is. So to think, to show how psychology would help with a problem. I know in a major city right now, I won't out them, though the letter N might not be uh, irrelevant to the name of the city. There's a challenge with a law coming in that's going to throw people off benefit rolls, people who deserve lawfully to be on them, but they're going to have to do some stuff to stay on the rolls.
Okay.
How is that problem going to be solved? I mean, it might be that people won't take the steps they need to take. What can you do to get people to take those steps? Their lives may be, in some sense, in the balance, and this is
Right.
a psychology task. So I'm thinking that if there's a concrete problem or a policy domain that maybe has no partisan valence at all, uh,
Mm.
psychologists are kind of the first line of defense.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I will take that to heart as I continue to push forward on this. I remember some years ago having a lunch with Danny Kahneman, and it was at that point in my life. I remember sitting there saying, if psychology needs a seat at the table when it comes to these policy questions. And I remember him telling me, he said, how to get psychology a seat at the table. He said, I don't think that's the right question. And if I could go back in time, I would have asked him, like, what is the right question? So I will spend the rest of my life trying to figure out what the right question is. But somehow I feel like you're telling me something similar to what he was telling me, in that, it's not psychology as an end in and of itself, but psychology as a means to solving a problem that people care about. And to start there, with the the problem that people care about and then demonstrate how this can help solve. Yeah.
So the OECD, which is a very important organization, is very focused on sludge, understood as administrative barriers and burdens, and they
Mhm.
have a multi-nation effort to reduce sludge and to audit, to do a sludge audit. And part of it is all psychological, thinking what kind of sludge has what kind of effects on behavior. So does it make people feel frustrated and demeaned? Does it make people give up? Does it make people distrust government? And
Mm,
the work is essentially psychological. And the people who are doing the work may or may not be psychologists, but they're reading up a storm of psychology. So a seat at the table may be great if it's that the people who have seats at the table are spending their afternoons reading psychological work because it gives them a foundation to figure out how to do that work.
mhm.
That's just as good.
Excellent, excellent advice. Thank you. Thank you for that. Wonderful, Cass. I really cannot thank you enough for spending the afternoon and sharing your thoughts and your insights. Any final words before we wrap up?
Just I'm so grateful to you and honored by the chance to get to talk to you about all this. And I'm thinking that anything that can be done by people in psychology to address a public policy problem, almost certainly in the fullness of time, will contribute to the solution of that problem.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Cass. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Take
Both ways.
good care.
And you.
Bye-bye.